The precise moment when the vicar of North Frome found the body of Miss Celandine Wragg was 7:12 a.m., according to the long case clock in the rectory's entrance hall, a clock which, as Lord Peter Wimsey later observed with some interest, had not kept accurate time since the abdication crisis, though it maintained a rather touching effort to do so. Miss Wragg, a woman of 49 and a formidable uprightness both of posture and opinion, had been the verger's sister and the village's self-appointed moral barometer. She was discovered by the vicar in her drawing-room at Chestnut End, sitting bolt upright in a Queen Anne chair beside the unlit fireplace, quite dead and, most curiously, quite dry, despite the open umbrella clasped tightly in her lap. The vicar, Reverend Lucius Appershot, B.A., Oxon, a man whose stooped posture and apologetic cough had managed to camouflage an intellect once rumoured to have terrified his viva examiner, had come at his usual early hour for what he termed a Lenten pastoral call. Why one should begin a call before breakfast during Lent was a point on which the Reverend could not be drawn, but it was understood in North Frome that he did things early as a form of minor spiritual asceticism. The village constable, having been roused from his Sunday morning bacon by the agitated vicar, had sent word to the county, who, finding the whole thing oddish, had telephoned Lord Peter Wimsey at Tallboys, where he was staying for the weekend under the tenuous pretext of a cricketing society's annual general meeting. Lord Peter, having endured a dinner the night before, in which a retired colonel had attempted to quote Horace and succeeded only in offending Latin, justice, and good taste in equal measure, seized upon the incident as a welcome distraction. "Dead women and false quantities," he murmured as he climbed into the Daimler, "make for a much livelier Sunday than stewed haddock and misquoted Ars Poetica." He arrived in North Frome by 10, cheerfully overdressed in a herringbone suit with a lemon-yellow cravat, and proceeded at once to Chestnut End, a disagreeably symmetrical brick house flanked by precisely 2 yew trees, one of which leaned rather listlessly to the left, as though conscious of its aesthetic inadequacy. Sergeant Crutchley, a large man with a permanent expression of confused fortitude, greeted him with some relief. "Bit of a queer one, this, my lord," he muttered, gesturing toward the front parlour. Wimsey gave a little hum. "Queerer than usual, Crutchley. That's promising. I do so hate a tidy corpse." Inside, Miss Wragg's body still sat precisely as found, undisturbed but for the sheet respectfully placed over her lap. Her face bore no expression of alarm, surprise, or pain. Indeed, she looked as though she might rise at any moment to remonstrate with an imagined curate. The umbrella remained tightly clasped between her gloved hands, the tip resting neatly on the oriental rug. Wimsey examined her for a long moment in silence. "Did anyone in the village report rain this morning?" he asked finally. "No, my lord. Dry as a bone all night." Wimsey raised an eyebrow and moved toward the fireplace. On the mantelpiece sat an assortment of china cats, a framed photograph of King George V, and a carriage clock that had stopped, rather tellingly, at 7:17. Said Wimsey. "Do vicarages keep Greenwich Mean Time or some charming medieval variation?" This clock and the vicar appear to be in passionate disagreement. "Beg pardon, my lord." Wimsey turned. "No matter, Crutchley. A corpse with an umbrella, an unlit fire, and a violently punctual vicar. Something here is in jolly poor taste." He plucked a china cat from the mantel, examined its base, and replaced it gently. Then, turning to the sergeant, he said, "Let us begin, as one always must, with the unfortunates who heard nothing unusual, saw nothing at all, and are nonetheless full of suggestive irrelevancies." Crutchley blinked. "You mean interview the neighbours, my lord?" "Precisely. But do be careful not to ask the wrong questions too soon. Nothing frightens a murderer so terribly as relevance." Lord Peter Wimsey tucked his chin deeper into his collar and stepped out into the morning air, which held that peculiar English mixture of clean dampness and faint manure, what the poet might term sweet decay. Behind him, the sergeant conferred with a constable about sealing off the drawing-room, though it was unlikely the villagers of North Frome would disturb anything without proper invitation or a signed order from the bishop. He strolled down the short gravel path of Chestnut End, paused to inspect the tilting yew tree. He tapped the bark twice with his cane to no obvious effect, and continued toward the modest row of cottages lining the road beyond. He paused at the first gate, which bore a small painted sign, Miss Tappert, Seamstress and Gentle Repairs. Inside, the curtains twitched. Good. He was expected. Miss Tappert herself was one of those thin, papery women whose voice, once raised, gave one the odd impression of having been whittled down from something larger and more operatic. She greeted Whimsy with a curtsy, nearly vertical in its angle. "Oh, my lord, such terrible goings-on, though I can't say I'm entirely surprised, no indeed. Poor Miss Ragg always said she expected to go quickly, though I doubt she meant sitting up like a churchwarden with an umbrella, if you'll forgive the irreverence." Whimsy smiled faintly. "My dear Miss Tappert, irreverence is the sincerest form of village intelligence. Did you happen to see, or more importantly, hear, anything curious this morning?" "Only the dustman, and he's curious by trade," she sniffed. "No, my lord. Quiet as the tomb. Except, well, there was something odd. Not that I'd go putting stock in it, mind." "Please do. I collect oddities." She leaned forward. "At about 6:30, or near enough, I heard a bell. Not a doorbell, too thin for that. A little tinkle, like a bicycle bell, or perhaps one of them fancy servants' gongs." "A servant's gong?" "You know the sort. Miss Ragg had one installed after that business with the wasps in 27. Summoned the verger if she so much as saw a beetle. She never liked killing things herself." "I see." Whimsy considered this. "And you're quite sure of the time?" "I'd just poured out my tea. I always take it before the milk van comes. Sour milk's a sin, my father used to say." Whimsy nodded gravely, as though this theological position demanded profound respect. He thanked her and moved along the row, gathering more of the same. General astonishment, moral disapproval, and very little in the way of useful data. Except, at number 3, he encountered young Master George Fitton, aged 12 and possessing the sharp, speculative gaze of one who has spent too many afternoons spying on everyone and too few being spied upon. George, emboldened by the sight of a titled stranger with a walking stick, launched at once into confidence. "Mr. Whimsy, sir, my dad says it were the vicar done it." "Does he indeed?" said Whimsy, adjusting his monocle. "Well, he says not in them words, but he said, 'That vicar's up to something, mark me,' and he said it last week. That's very prescient of him. Did he say what precisely the vicar was up to?" George considered. "He was in the lane near the woods. Reverend Appershot, I mean, standing there like he was thinking hard, and then he ran. And that's not usual, see? He don't run. Dad says he's got a leg like a sick goat." "A vivid image," murmured Whimsy. "Do you happen to remember the day?" "Tuesday, because Mum burnt the sausages that night and we had to have bread and dripping." Whimsy patted the boy on the shoulder and made a mental note to question Reverend Appershot again, gently, but with emphasis. Back at Chestnut End, Sergeant Crutchley had set up a makeshift station in the front hall. The constable was interviewing a particularly tremulous charwoman when Whimsy stepped in. "I believe the Reverend is still about?" he inquired. Crutchley nodded. "He's in the study, my lord. Been waiting to give a more formal statement." Whimsy found the vicar in a room filled with theological texts and a faint, lemony smell suggestive of furniture polish and anxiety. Appershot stood as Whimsy entered, his hands clasped behind his back, as though uncertain whether this was to be confession or interrogation. "My lord, I had no notion you were in the county." "No one ever does. It's part of my charm. May I ask a few questions?" "Of course. I have nothing to conceal." "That," said Whimsy cheerfully, "is always the best way to make me suspicious." He settled into an armchair. Now, you discovered the body at approximately 7:12? Yes. I arrived just before, by my own clock, of course. Hers, I noticed, had stopped at 7:17. Curious, that. Yes, said the vicar, but not necessarily significant. Whimsy leaned back. Let us be trivial, then. Why were you visiting so early? I often take morning calls during Lent. Miss Wragg had expressed a wish to speak with me about the Easter arrangements. She was fastidious about the floral hierarchy. And she expected you? Yes. She said to come early. She was not fond of interruptions. She often kept her door locked from the inside. I was to let myself in. Whimsy raised an eyebrow. And did you? I did. No trouble with the lock? None at all. It was unlocked. Yet she often kept it locked. Yes. There was a brief silence. Tell me, said Whimsy, his voice light, do you often carry an umbrella indoors? Appershot looked at him, startled. Certainly not. No, nor do most, but Miss Wragg had one clenched quite tightly, I observed. Perhaps she feared a storm, or perhaps she was expecting a disagreeable visitor. The vicar hesitated. She was in some distress of late. I don't mean medically, but uneasy. I attributed it to the choir scandal. Ah, yes, said Whimsy, as though this were the most natural thing in the world. Sopranos and treble boys are known agents of moral panic. She dismissed the new organist rather suddenly, the vicar said. Young Mr. Frobisher, a gifted player, though rather too fond of theatrical flourishes. Whimsy's eyebrows rose. Flourishes? Trills, my lord. Arpeggios, in the Magnificat. Quite unsuitable. Unforgivable, murmured Whimsy. Was there bad blood? I think he was infatuated. He called on Miss Wragg more than was strictly necessary. Her brother, the verger, took a dim view. And what became of Mr. Frobisher? He left last month, quite without ceremony. Some say he was dismissed, others that he stormed off. No one knows. Whimsy stood. I think we should locate Mr. Frobisher, don't you? Anyone who adds trills to the Magnificat is at least capable of murder. He turned at the door. Oh, and one more thing, Reverend. Were you in the woods last Tuesday? Appershot blinked. The woods? Why, yes. I often walk there. It calms the nerves. Of course it does, said Whimsy with a courteous nod. But next time, do try not to run. It upsets the local children. He left the vicar staring at the empty doorway, brows drawn. As he rejoined Crutchley in the hall, Whimsy took up his hat and glanced back once more toward the drawing-room. She sat down to talk, he said quietly. Not to die. That, Sergeant, is what makes the whole thing so dreadfully impolite. And with that, they stepped out into the sunlit lane, where somewhere in the distance a bell was tolling noon, 2 hours too late and, like everything else in North Frome, not quite in tune with the facts. The noon bell, dutiful, wheezing, and slow, had barely finished its final chime when Lord Peter Whimsy, hat tilted back, turned to Sergeant Crutchley with the gentle air of a man about to commit a minor social indiscretion. Sergeant, he said, I should like a word with the verger. Mr. Josiah Wragg, is it not? Brother of the departed. Crutchley, who had developed a protective fondness for Whimsy's odd requests, finding in them a reliable signpost that the investigation was quietly leaving the ordinary world, nodded. Lives at the edge of the churchyard, my lord. Hasn't left the house since we told him. Grief or calculation? Whimsy murmured. Or both, perhaps. Grief with calculation is the most respectable of emotional states. Lead on. They found Josiah Wragg in a low, slate-roofed cottage so close to the old church walls it seemed half swallowed by stone. The garden had been laid out with grim precision. Clipped box hedges, tight rows of marigolds, and it was here they discovered the verger, kneeling before a patch of recently disturbed soil. He was a tall man, narrow of chest and thick of jaw, with a face that had settled into the long, heavy melancholy of habit, not trauma. He rose as they approached, brushing his hands on his cassock, which was smudged at the knees. "I'm sorry," he said in a voice like coarse wool. "I've already spoken to the constable." "Quite so," Whimsy replied, gently removing his hat. "But you see, I have a passion for repetition. Tell me, if you would, how you came to learn of your sister's untimely repose." Rag's jaw clenched slightly. "The vicar came knocking just after 7. Said he'd found her gone. I came at once." "Gone," said Whimsy thoughtfully. A rather elegant euphemism, considering the state of things. "She wouldn't have liked anything cruder," said Rag stiffly. "No, she wouldn't," Whimsy agreed. "She looked the sort to keep her dying discreet." "Tell me, Mr. Rag, was she in the habit of receiving the vicar at such an hour?" The verger hesitated. "She was fond of punctuality, and Lent made her nervous. Easter arrangements, choir business." "Ah, yes, the choir scandal," Whimsy said, smiling faintly. "Miss Rag was instrumental in the organist's departure, I hear. Was there animosity between them?" "She thought he was unsuitable," said Rag. "Too modern." "Modernity is a cruel charge," Whimsy said, "especially in ecclesiastical circles. Did young Mr. Frobisher take his dismissal quietly?" "I don't know. She never told me the details." Whimsy examined him a moment. "You're a man of the cloth, Mr. Rag. Of a sort. Do you believe in divine timing?" The verger looked up, puzzled. "I'm not sure I follow." "Your sister died, according to the vicar, at approximately 7:12. A clock in the house stopped at 7:17. She held an umbrella indoors, on a dry morning, and yet the front door was unlocked, despite her usual habit. Doesn't that strike you as oddly orchestrated?" Josiah Rag's brow darkened. "She was careful, but not paranoid. Perhaps she forgot." "Perhaps," said Whimsy. "But forgetting is rarely symmetrical. Most people forget one thing at a time. Your sister, it seems, forgot quite a lot all at once, unless someone helped her forget." The man's expression remained fixed, but Whimsy caught the faint twitch at the corner of his right eye. A grief-numbed man, or one too alert to permit grief its full course. "And you, Mr. Rag, where were you at the time?" "In the vestry, preparing the registers." "Alone?" "Yes." Whimsy smiled pleasantly. "A vestry is a convenient place. One can always say one was preparing something, and no one can gainsay it unless they're very rude." Crutchley coughed softly. "We've no one who saw him until after the fact, my lord." Whimsy tilted his head. "You're not a superstitious man, I presume?" "No," said Rag shortly. "Then you'll have no objection to answering one last question. Had your sister been afraid of anything in recent days? Something real, not divine?" Rag looked away, toward the tightly cut hedges. "She mentioned someone watching the house. Said she saw a man by the lane 2 nights in a row. Could have been nothing. Might have been the boy, George Fitton. But she thought otherwise. She said the figure was too tall." "Interesting," Whimsy said. "I think you've been quite helpful, Mr. Rag. I should very much like to see the vestry now." The walk back to the church was uneventful, save for the occasional sideways glance from parishioners who moved like polite specters under the watchful gaze of uncertainty. Inside the vestry, Whimsy moved with unhurried precision, observing every detail, the ledgers neatly stacked, the faint smell of mildew and ink, the pair of worn gloves resting on a stool. "You'll note," he said softly to Crutchley, "there's no sign of fresh candle wax, and the inkwell's surface is undisturbed. Either Mr. Rag has the tidiest hand in Christendom, or he wasn't here at all this morning. But then where? Somewhere close enough to reach Chestnut End before the vicar, perhaps," Whimsy murmured. "And now I think it's time we tracked down this discarded organist. Frobisher, he may be the key to our deeper tones." It was not difficult to locate Mr. Anthony Frobisher. The boy Fitton, eager to earn further distinction, provided Whimsy with a crude but accurate map. "He's staying with the Withers, up behind the cricket ground." You'll hear him before you see him. He practices on an old harmonium that squeals like a stuck pig." True enough. As they approached the low white cottage, they heard scales executed with such wild enthusiasm and indifferent precision that Whimsy chuckled audibly. "Surely," he said, "no man in the grip of guilt would permit himself that much arpeggio." Anthony Frobisher, when he appeared, was tall, pale, and theatrical. He wore a cravat too large for his neck and sported a moustache which looked as though it had been sketched in a moment of overconfidence and never quite erased. "Lord Peter Whimsy," he said, as if tasting the name. "I confess, I never thought I'd be questioned by the man himself. Terribly exciting. I assume this is about Celandine Wragg." "That is her name, yes," said Whimsy, stepping inside. "Unusual, isn't it?" "She hated it," Frobisher said, with a grin not quite sympathetic. "Insisted on being called Miss Wragg, even in private, which, let me tell you, made certain conversations frightfully awkward." Whimsy's gaze sharpened, though his voice remained mild. "Private conversations? Were you involved?" Frobisher's eyebrows lifted. "Good Lord, no. She was twice my age and built like a flagpole. But she did invite me round more often than necessary. Lonely, I suppose. Or suspicious. She fancied someone was out to get her." "Any idea who?" "She suspected Wragg, I think. Said he resented her meddling. There was a quarrel, apparently, behind the vestry. Quite the scene. But no one dares argue with Miss Wragg in public, so it passed without note." "And what of the vicar?" "Appershot? Oh, he disapproved of me from the start. Too emotional. Said I played Bach like Berlioz. But I liked him. He's got one of those painfully sincere souls. The sort that confesses other people's sins." Whimsy turned to go, pausing at the door. "One last thing, Mr. Frobisher. Did Miss Wragg keep a spare key?" "She said she didn't, but I wouldn't be surprised if Josiah had one. She was always leaving notes about things she couldn't remember, times, appointments, locks. I once found one in a hymn book. Check cellar before bed. Never knew what she meant." "I imagine we shall," said Whimsy. "Sooner or later." As they left the cottage and the discordant chords faded behind them, Whimsy turned to Crutchley and said, "We are nearly ready for our rehearsal. All we lack now is the stage direction, time, sound, locks and lies. It's all beginning to chime." He glanced at the church steeple, where the bell, long silent, sat waiting. "And when it does," he added, "I rather think the whole village will hear it." The village lane was thick with mid-afternoon hush, the sort of hush that settles only after scandal has been digested, gossiped over tea, and passed on to the next cottage. Lord Peter Whimsy strolled alongside Sergeant Crutchley, his gait loose, but his glance twitching to each roofline and hedgerow as if parsing a musical score none but he could hear. "I don't suppose," he said lazily, "that our Mr. Wragg has a key to the church cellar?" Crutchley frowned. "I shouldn't think so, my lord. There's no cellar beneath the vestry, or none I've ever seen." "Which is rather the point," Whimsy murmured. "People rarely inspect what they've always assumed does not exist. I should like to inspect it nonetheless. Something in that young organist's remark about a hymn book note caught me sideways." They cut back toward the church. The gravestones crouched like weary sentries in the long grass. The west door, narrow and half sunk, groaned reluctantly under Crutchley's shove. Inside, the air was close with cold stone and candle wax. Whimsy moved like a man following memory rather than evidence, stepping into the vestry and pausing before the row of choir robes and carved cupboards. "There," he said suddenly. "Do you see?" Crutchley squinted. "A slight draught, my lord." "Exactly." Whimsy crouched and ran his gloved hand along the baseboard beneath the cupboard. It gave a soft click. With a gentle tug, the wood creaked open to reveal a small, square trap door, no more than 3 feet across. "Well," Crutchley said, blinking, "that's never been in the inventory. Most secrets, said Whimsy, aren't. Help me lift it, would you? They heaved the panel aside, revealing a narrow stone stair twisting downward into darkness. Whimsy withdrew a small electric torch from his coat, one of those modern conveniences he tolerated in moderation, and descended first, followed by the sergeant, with the expression of a man resigned to unpleasant discoveries. The cellar was scarcely more than a crypt. Damp flagstones, a faint mouldering scent, and rows of shelving, some containing hymnals, ancient candle holders, and in one corner a stack of wooden boards painted for what appeared to be some long-forgotten church play. Odd place to store drama, Whimsy observed, and yet rather apt. He swung the torch slowly over the walls, then paused. Sergeant, come here. What do you make of that? Near the floor on the far wall was a scuffed patch of stone, the mortar cleaner in a rectangle precisely the shape of a wooden box, but the box itself was missing. A trunk stood here recently, Crutchley said. Heavy enough to mark the stone. Gone now. Gone? But where? They searched quickly, but the room revealed no other exit. Whimsy stood in silence, his eyes on the shelf above the vacant space. A scrap of paper was tucked between two hymnals. He extracted it delicately. "Ha," he breathed, "for safekeeping until St. Agnes moans." My dear Sergeant, how charmingly baroque. Crutchley looked puzzled. Some sort of local proverb? Or perhaps a musical clue, Whimsy said, though more likely a pun. Miss Ragg appears to have been fond of concealing things in plain sight. I suspect she left more notes scattered about. Do you think the boy Fitton might assist in a little literary excavation? Crutchley nodded. He's thorough and curious. Shall I send him? Do. Tell him to check every hymnal in the nave and choir stalls. If Miss Ragg had a system, and she strikes me as the type who would, it may yet illuminate something charmingly inconvenient. They returned to the surface world and dispatched young Fitton with his scavenger hunt before retiring, at Whimsy's suggestion, to the rectory for tea and a light interrogation. The vicar, Reverend Appershot, received them in a drawing-room heavily perfumed with lavender and regret. He sat with both hands on his knees, as if bracing for spiritual turbulence. I do hope, he began, that none of this suggests impropriety. Only devotion, said Whimsy mildly. Your arrival this morning was most timely. Just after 7? 7:08, Appershot corrected. I keep the time by the long case clock in the passage, which I set each Friday. Punctuality is a virtue, Whimsy murmured, though in this case, possibly fatal. Forgive me. What prompted the visit? Appershot's ears flushed. We were to discuss the Easter program, the service layout, altar dressing, music. Miss Ragg was head of the ladies' committee. Quite. And was it customary to meet her so early? No, but she requested it, said she had to leave the house by 8 to visit her niece in Melbury. A rare concession. Whimsy nodded slowly. And she mentioned nothing odd in her note? It wasn't a note, said the vicar. She told me in person, after evensong last Wednesday. Whimsy's gaze sharpened slightly. And did Mr. Ragg attend evensong? Aye. The vicar frowned. Now that you ask, I believe he left before the end. Said he had a touch of lumbago. Lumbago is a singularly useful condition, said Whimsy. It permits a man to avoid kneeling and attend to mischief unobserved. Appershot blinked. You think Josiah? No, surely not. He and his sister quarreled often, but he was devoted. In his way. Ah, yes, in his way is a category of devotion rarely suitable for sainthood, Whimsy said. Tell me, Reverend, had Miss Ragg any unusual visitors lately? I saw a stranger near her garden gate last week, said the vicar after a pause. Tall, dark coat. I assumed it was someone from the diocese. Someone from the diocese, Whimsy repeated thoughtfully. Did she mention any such call? No, but she had been more secretive than usual. I assumed it was nerves. You understand? Lent does weigh on some parishioners. Indeed, especially those preparing to confess, or to be confessed to. There came at that moment a knock. Crutchley rose and opened the door to reveal young Fitton, eyes wide, cheeks flushed with urgent discovery. "Sir, my lord, there was something in the Psalter, tucked behind the collects. A note. It's got a list. Times and names. And one's underlined. Tuesday, 7:14. And a name I don't know. Morville." Whimsy took the paper, held it to the light. His face remained unreadable, though a slight tension tightened the corners of his mouth. "Morville," he said softly. "That rings not at all, which means it's likely to ring very loudly indeed before long. Sergeant, we must locate every parish record that mentions that name, and then, I believe, we shall pay another visit to Mr. Ragg, who, I think, has rather more to explain than he pretends." He folded the note precisely and slipped it into his pocket. "Come, Crutchley. We're about to find out what Miss Ragg knew at 7:14 that she did not at 7:13. And that, I suspect, is precisely when she became dangerous to someone else. Shall I proceed with Section 5? The narrow garden path behind the Ragg cottage was littered with wind-blown rose petals and a scattering of damp laundry clips, as though the household had taken fright in the middle of its daily rituals. Lord Peter paused at the back gate, drawing in the sharp scent of crushed mint that rose where his boot had flattened a tuft of herb. The cottage itself was quiet, its whitewashed walls betraying no signs of disturbance or distress, save, perhaps, the drawn curtains, a shade darker than before. Crutchley knocked once, firmly, and before the echo had faded, the door creaked open to reveal Josiah Ragg. He had changed from his church-going black into a sagging cardigan and worn slippers, but the stony stiffness of his expression remained fixed. "I told you all I know," he said, eyes darting briefly toward Whimsy. "I've nothing else to add." "But possibly something to explain," Whimsy said with the lightness of a man declining sugar. "We've found a note, Mr. Ragg, hidden by your sister in a hymnal, rather a remarkable one." The old man stepped back reluctantly. "You'd better come in." The sitting room had the grey, airless atmosphere of spaces no longer inhabited with spirit. A cross-stitch of the Beatitudes hung crookedly above the mantel, and the fire had gone out. On a side table lay a bottle of aspirin, half a slice of untouched toast, and a crumpled copy of the Church Times. Whimsy took a chair with theatrical delicacy and produced the note, now flattened and placed in a protective sleeve. "Your sister noted a meeting," he said. "Tuesday at precisely 7:14. She underlined the time. The name Morville appears. Does that signify anything to you?" Ragg did not answer immediately. He stood at the hearth, gripping the mantel so tightly his knuckles whitened. "I knew the name," he said at last. "Long ago. Edith, my sister, was fond of writing things down. She never forgot anything, but she wrote it down anyway, as if setting it to paper gave her power over it." "And this Morville?" Whimsy prompted gently. "Not from here. Not a village name. He was a kind of agent. Estate man, they called him. A London fellow. Managed funds, properties. He came around once or twice. Back in 09, or was it 10? For your father." Ragg's face twisted slightly. "For my sister, Edith had money. She didn't speak of it, not often. She'd been engaged before the war. Man died in Mesopotamia, left her a sum, through Morville. And this Morville continued to correspond." "I don't know," Ragg snapped. "She didn't share her letters with me. We lived under one roof, but that didn't mean she told me her secrets." "No," said Whimsy. "But I suspect she wrote them somewhere. In code, perhaps. A habit among women of a certain cleverness. Did she keep a diary?" Ragg's mouth opened, shut, and then opened again. "There's a drawer she kept locked. I never touched it. Indeed. Might we have a look? There was a long pause, then a stiff nod. Ragg led them to a sideboard in the dining room, unlocked a low cupboard, and withdrew a box covered in faded maroon velvet. Its brass fittings gleamed faintly, well polished despite, or because of their obscurity. He passed it to Whimsy with an odd air of resignation. Inside were 3 notebooks, each meticulously dated. The top one, April 1937 to January 1938, was marked with a pressed violet and a sticker, Private. Whimsy turned a few pages, eyes scanning the tight, upright hand. "She notes everything," he murmured. Choral arrangements, shopping lists, minutes from the altar guild, and interleaved among them observations. Cryptic, but not unintelligible. Morville spoke again of the southern property, too risky to liquidate, and, here we are. Tuesday, M will arrive, must give final refusal. Not safe to keep papers hereafter. He looked up. So, Miss Ragg was in possession of something, a document or documents, valuable enough to make her fear for their safety. And then, after arranging to meet someone named Morville, she's found dead. One might be forgiven for noting a pattern. Crutchley frowned, but no signs of forced entry, and if the motive was robbery, why not ransack the place? "Because," said Whimsy, "whoever came knew exactly what they were looking for and exactly where to find it, which suggests it was someone close, someone she trusted, or someone who had gained her trust." Josiah Ragg gave a bitter laugh. She didn't trust anyone, not really, but she had a way of pretending to, thought it polite. "Christian." He paused. "You think this Morville fellow killed her?" Whimsy tucked the diary away. "I think someone killed her for what she knew. Morville may have been the lever, or the lock. We'll know soon enough." They left the cottage as the sun began to drag its hem across the distant hills. Back at the police office, Whimsy instructed Crutchley to begin searching public record archives for the name Morville in connection with estate or trust, management, especially any involving legacies, lapsed heirs, or misappropriated funds. Meanwhile, Whimsy took up residence in the local library's dusty genealogical files. What emerged over the next 4 hours was a trail not of criminality, but concealment. Morville, it turned out, had been an independent fiduciary agent, a man who specialized in managing quiet inheritances for families who did not wish their names in the papers. In 1917, a sum of $4,000 had been placed in his charge for Miss Edith Ragg of Market Illings, designated for independent use following cessation of engagement. The benefactor was a Captain Horace Leamington, killed at Cut. No mention of marriage, no legal will filed. A gift, perhaps, or guilt money. More curious still, in 1922, Morville had been investigated in a private inquiry following a claim by a Miss F.T. Sandley that he had defrauded her of her inheritance. The case was never brought to court. Sandley withdrew her complaint suddenly and disappeared from public record. When Whimsy relayed this to Crutchley, the sergeant whistled. Could be the same pattern, targeting women with money and no protectors. "Quite," Whimsy said, tapping his fingers against his temple. But Edith Ragg wasn't fooled. She refused. She knew the pattern and marked the time. 7:14, the moment she saw through whoever was standing on her threshold. And they knew it. Crutchley said slowly, "But if this Morville's a confidence man, how do we find him now? He may be dead or under a different name." "Ah," said Whimsy, eyes brightening. "That is precisely the riddle. Because our Edith was meticulous, she would not record a name if it were wholly false. That tells me the name Morville must be at least partly true. Perhaps not a name, but a place, a connection." He stood suddenly. "Sergeant, we must pay a visit to the parish register, the one the vicar keeps locked in the vestry. I want to see every baptism, burial, and marriage involving the name Morville, or any family connected to that name, And if my suspicions are correct, we may find that our killer didn't come from London at all, but rather never truly left this place." Crutchley stared. "You think Morville was local?" "I think," said Whimsy, smiling grimly, "that the killer thought they'd buried the past, but Edith Ragg had the inconvenient habit of remembering. The vestry at St. Jude's had the air of a place that distrusted innovation. The stone walls were damp to the touch. The ancient register sat beneath a faded altar cloth, and the smell of old wood polish lingered faintly under the incense and mildew. Reverend Pilbeam, once coaxed with a rather shame-faced invocation of ecclesiastical duty, had unlocked the cupboard and left them alone with the ledgers, though not before remarking that they were almost certainly wasting their time. With a smile that implied a polite wish they would go away quietly and not bother the church mice. Lord Peter, however, had settled on a bench with the enthusiasm of a man opening a rare folio. Crutchley hovered behind him, arms folded, trying not to look too constable-like among the hassocks and brass candlesticks. "Let us see," Whimsy murmured, flipping back through the thick vellum leaves. Morville. Morville. He ran his finger down a column of baptisms, then across to a list of marriages. Aha! Not quite the name itself, but a cousin of it. He tapped the page. March 1894. James Morville married Sarah Ann Troth of this parish. Morville with an E. Not quite the same, but near enough to raise suspicion. Witnesses, Horace Leamington and Edith Ragg. Crutchley leaned in. "That's our man, the captain who left her the legacy." "Exactly. So she knew both bride and groom. The Troths were local. I'd wager anything Sarah Ann was a childhood friend. Or rival." Whimsy turned another page, slower now. "Now what do we have in burials?" "Oh dear." He tapped again. 1899, Sarah Ann Morville, aged 28. Cause of death, accidental fall from stairwell. No further notes. And James Morville, no entry under that name afterward. Vanished or departed, or both. Crutchley straightened. If James Morville disappeared around the same time and re-emerged as Morville, that would fit your theory. Changed a letter, disappeared into finance, started fleecing lonely women. Indeed. And if Miss Ragg had kept quiet all these years, perhaps for the sake of Sarah Ann's memory, or perhaps out of fear, then received a visit from someone she recognized, under a different name. She'd know, said Crutchley, finishing the thought, and if he realized she knew. Whimsy shut the ledger carefully and stood. Then we have the beginnings of a very old grudge returning to bloom. Something rooted not just in greed, but in shame. And it's never mere theft, you know, Crutchley. Always pride, fear, guilt, rather than the price of a pearl necklace or a forged will. They returned to the lane as the bells tolled 8, the evening mist curling through the hedgerows like a theatrical entrance queue. In the distance, the lamps of the Ragg cottage glowed faintly behind drawn curtains, and the occasional cough of a farm tractor punctuated the dusk. "What now?" asked Crutchley, not without weariness. "We must trace the Morville line," said Whimsy. "We'll see if any James Morville appears in other records after 1899. Probate files, company registers, banking institutions. But more pressingly..." He stopped. A figure was waiting beside his motor, half-shadowed by the churchyard yews. It was Mrs. Felicity Dench. She wore a hat that must have seen its best decade 2 decades ago, and gloves that trembled slightly on her hands as she stepped forward. Her face was pale and alert. "I've done something dreadful, Lord Peter," she said, voice barely above a whisper, "and I can't bear the silence any longer." Whimsy inclined his head. "Shall we sit inside the motor, madam? It is, as you say, rather a dreadfully silent evening." Inside the vehicle, with Crutchley seated discreetly to one side, Mrs. Dench produced a folded handkerchief and pressed it to her lips. "I didn't kill her," she began, eyes darting between them, "but I was there. I saw him." Whimsy raised a brow but said nothing. Silence, in these matters, had a way of loosening tongues more effectively than any interrogation. "I was delivering the church flowers," she went on. "I do them every Tuesday morning. Mrs. Wragg insisted on real lilies. I came a bit earlier than usual. My boy had a dentist appointment, so I meant to do it quickly. I was walking past the back of her cottage when I heard voices. A man's voice, polished, not from around here, and hers. She sounded frightened." She paused. "I didn't see much, but he came out the side door around 7:15. Tall, dark coat, bowler hat, not young. Walked away like nothing had happened. I didn't think anything of it at the time. Just assumed it was someone from the diocese. But when I heard the news," she clutched her handkerchief tighter, "I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing his face, and I remembered I'd seen him before, in June, at the vicar's garden party. He was speaking to Josiah Wragg. I thought he was a cousin, but Josiah never said." Whimsy's expression sharpened. "And the vicar?" "Oh, he barely spoke to the man. Seemed flustered, if you ask me. Introduced him as Mr. Mariner. That was it." "Not Morville?" "No, Mariner. But I swear it's the same man." Whimsy sat back, tapping his fingers against the leather upholstery. "Thank you, Mrs. Dench. That's extraordinarily helpful. Would you be willing to describe this gentleman for a sketch artist?" "If it helps catch who did it," she said with sudden vehemence. "Yes." When she had gone, Crutchley whistled again. "Same man. Changed his name twice over. First Morville to Morville, then to Mariner. And always keeping to the same trick, one step removed from truth," Whimsy said. "He's like a badly dressed ghost, leaves just enough to be remembered, never enough to be caught. But why risk coming back? Perhaps to tie off a loose end. Perhaps something in Edith's possession threatened him, papers or memories or something more damning. Or perhaps he simply thought she wouldn't recognize him after so many years. But she did." Whimsy's gaze turned thoughtful. "There's one more piece that doesn't fit. The vicar's arrival. Too early by half an hour. Too conveniently early. You think he's involved?" "I think," Whimsy said, "that he may have seen something he hasn't told us. Or else someone told him something alarming enough to send him down that Lane before his supper was even cold." He opened the car door. "Come, Crutchley, let us pay a call on the Reverend again. I have the strangest feeling his memory may be about to improve." Reverend Pilbeam's study, while modest, bore the faintly threadbare dignity of a clergyman resigned to the cohabitation of theology and drafts. Books on liturgy jostled with a well-thumbed Bradshaw's Railway Guide, and a fire glowed dutifully in the grate, though its contribution to warmth was more symbolic than effective. The vicar himself looked up with a practiced expression of mild surprise, folding his paper along a column on ecumenical discord in the Channel Isles. "Lord Peter, Sergeant, I must say, you gentlemen keep irregular hours." "We're hoping to catch a thought at large," said Whimsy, sinking into the horsehair chair as if paying a social call. "The fugitive variety that only comes out at dusk when it thinks it won't be noticed. You don't mind if we smoke, do you?" Without waiting for reply, he withdrew a slim case and offered a cigarette to Crutchley, who declined with a grimace. Whimsy lit his own with fastidious care. "I believe I asked you the other day what prompted you to visit Miss Wragg that evening," he said conversationally. "You mentioned something about supper. Cold cuts, wasn't it?" "Indeed," said the vicar after a pause. "Leftover ham. Not especially memorable." "No," said Whimsy, exhaling smoke with the air of a man filing away an unimportant fact. "But I wonder now whether it was the ham, or something more foreboding." Pilbeam hesitated. "I'm not quite sure I follow." "It's the timing, you see. You arrived at Miss Wragg's door at precisely 20 to 8. 3 separate clocks confirm it, and none of them yours, I might add. One doesn't usually hurry to call on spinsters in the rain unless there's some pressing matter, especially not before dessert." The vicar's mouth tightened and he removed his glasses. polishing them slowly. "There was a note," he said finally. "It was pushed under my door sometime after evensong. No envelope, just a scrap of paper. It said, 'Come quickly. ER is in danger.' That's all." Whimsy inclined his head. "And you recognize the handwriting?" "No, it was block letters. A child might have written it, or someone disguising their hand." "And you went alone?" "I did. Foolishly, perhaps. I didn't alert anyone. I thought it might have been some drunken mischief. But then, I knew Miss Ragg could be forthright. She'd made enemies over the years." "Indeed," said Whimsy dryly. "Moral certainty has that unfortunate side effect. But when you arrived—" "She didn't answer the door. I went round and found it slightly ajar. That struck me as odd, and I pushed inside. Then I saw her, slumped at the table. I thought at first she had fallen. It wasn't until I touched her wrist that I understood." Whimsy nodded. "And the note?" "I burned it," said Pilbeam. "It seemed foolish, even cowardly afterward. But I thought, what if it was a prank? What if I was being watched? I didn't want to be mixed up in gossip." "Ah," said Whimsy gently. "You're not the first clergyman to commit a sin of omission, nor, I dare say, the last. But you must understand, the note may have been our only clue as to who knew she was in danger." Pilbeam looked stricken. "I realize that now." Whimsy rose, brushing an invisible fleck from his sleeve. "And the man at the garden party, Mr. Mariner?" "Yes," said the vicar, voice low. "Josiah Ragg introduced him, said he was a cousin on his mother's side. I didn't probe. Frankly, I found the fellow unsettling. Too smooth. He called himself a financial advisor, talked about municipal bonds." "Ah, the true mark of evil," murmured Whimsy. "And did Miss Ragg speak to him?" "No, she stood at the other end of the lawn. She never once looked in his direction." "Because she recognized him," said Whimsy. "And that was the day she knew her past had found her again." As they walked back through the darkening churchyard, Crutchley broke the silence. "So he knew she'd seen him, and he left the note to lure the vicar away or implicate him?" Whimsy shook his head. "No, he left the note to bring the vicar there at just the right moment, when the body was still warm, but after the act. He wanted someone respectable to find her first, to confirm she had been alone when discovered. It was an alibi, not a warning." Crutchley stared. But then he must have known exactly how long it would take the vicar to walk there. "Precisely, which means he'd observed the vicar's habits, his supper hour, his reading time, and he knew Miss Ragg would be alone that night, save for a possible early visit from the flower lady. It was timed to the minute." Crutchley gave a low whistle. "Then he's local again, or has someone watching?" Whimsy stopped suddenly and looked back toward the lane, a flicker of grim amusement in his expression. "Crutchley, you remember that curious business of the carpet? The rolled-up one beside her chair?" "Yes, rolled tightly. Yet there were no marks of a struggle, no broken furniture, nothing displaced. Now why would a woman like Miss Ragg, who lived alone and prided herself on neatness, leave a carpet half-moved on a Tuesday evening?" Crutchley frowned. "Unless it was put there after. Or unless it was moved to conceal something," said Whimsy. "A scuff, a drop of blood, or perhaps a sign of tampering. We must examine that rug again, closely this time." They returned to the cottage under cover of night. The constable on watch let them in with a shrug, grumbling something about ghost hunting. Inside, the parlor was just as they had left it. Teacups, the scent of Parma violets still, faintly present, and the carpet neatly rolled and pinned at one side. Whimsy crouched, unfastened the pins, and began to unroll it with great care. Crutchley produced his torch, casting a low beam along the floorboards. "There," said Whimsy softly. On the underside of the rug was a series of dark marks, smears more than drops, and the faintest outline of a boot heel, reversed. "He stood on the rug," Whimsy said, "while he did it, then rolled it away so that no one would see the marks until after the scene was discovered and documented. But he forgot the underside. He counted on the shock and the clutter to mask it. Very nearly got away with it." Crutchley examined the print. "Size 9, perhaps 10. Narrow heel. Foreign make? Possibly Italian," said Whimsy. "Our mariner has a taste for refinement. He may even have brought the shoes from the continent. We'll compare prints once we get the sketch." Crutchley's brow furrowed. "But what now? We've got no name, no address, only aliases." "Oh, but we have something better," said Whimsy, rising with a grim smile. "We have a ghost." Crutchley blinked. "I beg your pardon." "A man who died in 1899 and rose again, first as Morville, now as Mariner. A man whose movements can be traced not through census forms, but through widows' ledgers and vanished investments. If we follow the money, old bank records, inheritance disputes, we'll find his trail. And when we do—" Whimsy turned to the fire, eyes gleaming. "We'll confront a man who has already buried one wife, silenced one witness, and now walks among us like a gentleman. But not for long, Crutchley. Not for long." Whimsy's remark about the ghost might have passed for one of his usual barbed witticisms, had Crutchley not noted the peculiar gleam in his eye as they stepped out into the night air. A mist had risen from the fields, veiling the moon and giving the hedgerows the uneasy look of crouching beasts. As they passed the lich gate, Whimsy paused and looked back once more at the shuttered windows of Ivy Lodge. "One forgets," he said quietly, "how easily murder masquerades as absence. One doesn't hear a scream because it never came. One doesn't see a struggle because it was planned to the minute. But a person vanishing from the records, that leaves a very loud silence." Crutchley coughed, not entirely comfortable with the philosophical turn. "Sir, if he's done this before, if the late Mrs. Morville was indeed his first victim, should we not start with her? Trace her estate, family, that sort of thing?" "Capital suggestion," Whimsy said, clapping him on the shoulder. "We'll start with the dead and work our way forward. Very Christian, don't you think? The problem is, we'll need to visit Lincolnshire, and preferably not on the milk train." By midday the next day, thanks to a combination of Whimsy's title, the persuasive influence of a call to a discreet acquaintance at the Home Office, and the efforts of a long-suffering clerk named Hibbert, they were ensconced in the Probate Records Office at Grantham, poring over wills, deeds, and letters of administration from the year 1900. Whimsy, who took a certain romantic pleasure in dusty ledgers and the scent of forgotten bureaucracies, moved through the names with patient deliberation. "There," he said at last, tapping a finger against the margin. "Morville, Anne Eliza, née Beamish, deceased May 4th, 1899. Spouse, Edward James Morville. Estate value, 1,535 and 7 shillings. Executor, husband. No issue. Buried in the churchyard of St. Fagan's, Wellthorpe." Crutchley leaned in. "Well, that's something. Decent sum for the time." "Yes, but note the absence of annuities or trust distributions," Whimsy murmured. "The lot went to him, no family bequests. Rather clean, and no mention of a solicitor. Suggests he handled the business himself. Curious." They made inquiries at St. Fagan's, where a thin, suspicious curate with nicotine-stained fingers offered to show them the burial register. Anne Eliza Morville, née Beamish, had indeed been interred beneath a modest headstone marked with a hymn verse and a sentimental epitaph. "Beloved and at peace." A storm the previous autumn had split the old yew tree over her grave, and part of the inscription had been worn away by rain. "No record of an inquest," the curate muttered, flipping through the margin notes. "Says sudden illness, signed by Dr. Willoughby. He retired years ago. Would you be so kind as to give us his last known address?" Whimsy asked, his tone at once courteous and inexorable. Dr. Willoughby, when finally tracked to a seaside bungalow where he lived in semi-voluntary exile, turned out to be a rheumy-eyed man who remembered Anne Eliza only vaguely. "Frail sort," he said. "Chest problems. No children. Very quiet. I was called in one morning. May, yes. Her husband said she'd been coughing all night. Turned blue. I wasn't surprised. She always had a weak heart." "You signed the death certificate?" Willoughby blinked. "Well, yes. There wasn't any suspicion." "No one suggested foul play?" asked Crutchley. "Oh, no," the doctor said, mildly affronted. He was very solicitous. Sat with her all night, apparently. Quite broken up about it. Whimsy, who had been inspecting the room's peeling paint with fastidious interest, turned. "Tell me, Doctor, was there ever a post-mortem?" No, not required in those days unless there were objections." "And were there?" asked Whimsy, already knowing the answer. The doctor looked puzzled. "From whom?" Whimsy made no reply, but as they left the bungalow, he said, "The perfect crime is not the one that is never discovered. It's the one no one ever thinks to investigate." They returned to the inn that night in silence, the rhythm of the train rocking them into a curious state of mental limbo. Crutchley finally broke the stillness. "He's done it before," he said, "and gotten away clean." "Yes," said Whimsy softly. "And Miss Wragg, who saw something she shouldn't have seen at that garden party, something in the eyes, in the manner of speaking, realized it. And once she realized it, she wrote someone. Not the vicar, I think. He was her conscience. But someone else. The envelope we found had been opened and destroyed. Meaning he'd already intercepted it before we arrived." Whimsy nodded. He must have known she was going to act. She had the confidence of one who had made a decision, taken steps. Perhaps she threatened him. Perhaps she merely told him what she knew. Crutchley gave a low whistle. And that was enough. "But not before she put something in motion," Whimsy said. "The question is, what?" By the time they returned to Cottlestone, the local postmistress had already been questioned discreetly. One telegram had been sent the day before Miss Wragg's death, from her to a solicitor in London. The message was terse and only half recorded. "Please come Monday. Urgent. Matter and the rest smudged, unreadable. "That was never meant to reach its recipient," Whimsy muttered. "He must have intercepted it, or bribed someone who did, and the solicitor never came." The turning point came, quite unexpectedly, from an unexpected source. The flower lady, Mrs. Philby, made an unscheduled visit to the station that afternoon with an armful of lavender and a look of fierce satisfaction. "I forgot," she said. "The morning I went to see Miss Wragg, I saw a car outside the gate. Black saloon, London plates. Looked like one of them hire ones, you know, for funerals or gents what don't like to be noticed." Whimsy's eyes brightened. "And you're certain of the number?" "Well, I wrote it down," she said with a sniff. "People think old women don't see things, but we do." Within 2 hours, Crutchley had traced the number to a private hire firm in Chelsea, discreetly catering to gentlemen in need of discretion. One Mr. Henry Mariner had indeed rented a vehicle from them 4 days before the murder. "Drove himself," said the clerk. "Refused a driver, paid in cash." It was enough. By nightfall, the village lay swaddled in hush, the only sounds those of wind brushing ivy and the occasional clink of cutlery in distant kitchens. Whimsy, in full evening dress, stood at the edge of the green with his back to the churchyard, waiting. The car approached silently, its lights dimmed. The man who stepped out was dapper in appearance, with gloved hands and a faint scent of imported tobacco. He approached without hesitation. "You requested a meeting," he said. "In writing, no less. Rather theatrical, I thought." "I do enjoy a good scene," Whimsy said cheerfully. And I thought it time. We dispensed with aliases, Mr. Morville. Or shall I say, Mr. Mariner? The man did not flinch, but a flicker of annoyance crossed his features. You're mistaken. No, said Whimsy. You are, about what people forget and what they remember. You thought Miss Ragg would be dismissed as an interfering old woman. You thought no one would notice the way you used a name recycled from another grave, or the small, strange habits, the left-handed cigarette, the preference for Darjeeling, the peculiar tic of correcting one's own grammar mid-sentence. You thought you were a ghost. The man glanced behind him. You've no proof. Oh, but I do, said Whimsy softly. You see, I don't require fingerprints or dramatic confessions. I merely need a woman who saw your face once and remembered it, even after 30 years. I need the rug you forgot to clean properly and the grave you thought no one would visit. I need your timing and your fear of being exposed again. That, sir, is more than enough. The man hesitated, then turned, to flee perhaps, or to strike. But Crutchley stepped out from the shadows, revolver drawn, and the moment passed. As he was led away, Whimsy stood very still, looking not at the man, but at the stars above the church tower. One doesn't vanquish ghosts, he said quietly. One merely names them. Whimsy remained for some time in the darkness, hands clasped behind his back, listening to the quiet sounds of Codlestone resuming its slow and somnolent rhythm. There was no cheering, no dramatic outburst from behind the curtained windows, only the dull clatter of boots as Morville, no Mariner, was escorted away like a man plucked from a dream and returned, abruptly, to the hard earth of consequence. Whimsy, never a great lover of triumphant moments, preferred the subtle dissolves, the last curtain falling without a bow. He turned to Crutchley, who had reappeared from the hedge, looking faintly unnerved and very young. I don't suppose, Whimsy said mildly, you have a cigarette that hasn't been pre-rolled by the Foreign Office and dipped in mustard gas. Crutchley, blinking, managed a grim chuckle and produced a rather crushed packet of Players. Whimsy took one and lit it with a match from his own monogrammed case. Well, he said, exhaling smoke into the mist. There we are, a very old-fashioned murder. Quite out of vogue, really. None of your cyanide in the cocktails or body in the library stuff. Merely a man who changed his name, killed twice with premeditation and an eye for simplicity, and very nearly got away with both. But why come back? Crutchley asked, rubbing the back of his neck. Surely he could have stayed buried. No one would have connected the names. Whimsy looked at him sideways. Ah, but you forget the peculiar nature of human arrogance. Mariner was clever, cleverer than most. But he couldn't quite relinquish control. Miss Ragg, in her own way, presented him with a unique threat. She remembered, but she also did something unforgivable in the eyes of such men. She acted, not out of greed nor blackmail, but sheer moral force. She disturbed the delicate fiction he had spun around himself for decades. That made her dangerous. But he must have known she wouldn't be believed. Oh, indeed. But she sent the telegram. That was the variable. The solicitor might have shown up, might have asked questions, might have brought the past roaring inconveniently back. He had no choice. Crutchley shifted uncomfortably. So he drove down in that car, entered the house unnoticed, killed her. Precisely. With morphia, most likely, or something similar. She was in pain, had the usual sedatives in the drawer. All he had to do was alter the dose, give it to her himself, and wait. He had done it once before, in Lincolnshire. He knew how the body would behave. And the vicar? Ah. Whimsy tapped ash from his cigarette into the breeze. Poor Canon Melling. His part is not yet played out. I believe he arrived earlier than expected, precisely because Miss Ragg had telephoned him in the morning, possibly warned him. He sensed urgency, perhaps even danger. So he came before supper, just in time to see Mariner leaving, or perhaps merely the tail of his coat disappearing into the lane. Crutchley stared. But why didn't he say so? Because he wasn't certain what he saw, and because— Whimsy paused. Because he feared the consequences. Melling is a man of conscience, not courage. His faith told him to protect the innocent, but his instinct for harmony, the parish, the community, his position, told him not to stir what might yet be put back under the rug. He's a good man, which is sometimes the most dangerous sort in a case like this. And now? Crutchley asked. Now he will have to decide which man he intends to be. They returned to Ivy Lodge the following morning to find it already swaddled in the genteel chaos of impending probate. A niece had arrived from Gloucester, a solicitor from Dorchester, and the village solicitor, the appropriately named Mr. Bland, hovered with the slightly self-important air of a man who had always suspected something was amiss but had wisely said nothing. Miss Ragg's possessions, however, had not yet been disturbed. Whimsy moved with unhurried precision through the narrow rooms, pausing occasionally to peer at a porcelain shepherdess or to open a drawer of ribbons that still bore the faintest trace of lavender. In the study, he found what he was looking for. It was in the third drawer down, beneath a layer of carefully folded receipts and expired bills, a small bundle of correspondence, tied with blue twine and labelled in her spidery hand, to be opened in event of my death. Well, he murmured, how very conscientious. He did not open it at once. Instead, he took it out onto the back veranda, where the breeze moved gently through the hedgerows and the rose bushes had begun to bloom in earnest. Only then did he untie the bundle. Inside were 6 letters, 3 to the solicitor, 2 to old friends in Bournemouth, and 1 to Canon Melling. The letter to Melling was short, written in trembling but legible script. It said only this: Dear Arthur, if anything should happen to me, I beg you will forgive me. I've written to Mr. Havering in London and left a record with my solicitor. I believe I know the truth about Edward Morville. He is here. He lives among us under a false name. You may not believe it, but I swear it is him. I fear what he may do. Do not speak of this unless I am gone. But if I am, please act. Affectionately, Joan Whimsy reread the letter, then folded it with infinite care and returned it to the envelope. She gave him the chance, he said aloud, to no one. And that's all one can do, really. Later that day, in the vestry of St. Luke's, Whimsy handed the letter to Canon Melling. The vicar, his face pale but composed, read it in silence. When he looked up, there was a grave weariness in his eyes. I thought it might be something like that, he said quietly. I saw him, I saw someone, but it seemed mad. I could not bring myself to accuse. I told myself it might be nothing, that Joan was merely frightened. Whimsy nodded. You did what many would have done. But now the choice is before you. Melling looked down at the letter, then at the cross that hung above the altar beyond the open door. She has spoken. I will not be silent now. That evening, Whimsy and Crutchley dined in the parlour of the inn. The fire had been lit, though it was June and the air was fragrant with the ghost of old wood smoke. Crutchley set down his fork. There's still something I don't quite grasp. How did you know it was him? Before we had the records. Whimsy smiled faintly. I didn't know, but I suspected. The house, the sudden departure from the city, the peculiar silence around his past. Most of all, the kind of man he was, one of those shape-shifters who drift between parishes, cities, social strata, always courteous, always pleasant, but with no history that ever rings true. People like that, he added, are either spies or something worse. Crutchley gave a small laugh. And which do you think he was? Oh, said Whimsy, rising and stretching, he was no patriot. He killed because he thought he could get away with it, and nearly did. That makes him tragically mundane. But it also makes him human. As he walked to the window, the moon rising full over Cottlestone Green. He added, almost to himself, "And that, my dear Crutchley, is what makes the game worth playing." The morning after the vicar's quiet reckoning dawned crisp and lemon-bright, the hedges around Cottlestone sharp with dew, and the village already abuzz with the news that travelled, as it always did, through kettle lids and curtain hems. The arrest had been discreet, but nothing escaped the watch of Mrs. Rowbotham, who ran the post office like a ship of war, and made it her mission to know who ordered liniment and who suddenly requested foreign stamps. Whimsy, of course, had already breakfasted and was walking, hatless and lightly gloved, along the narrow path that led from the inn toward the station. His suitcase, modest and worn, had been sent ahead, and he carried only a slim book in his hand, a volume of Herrick's verse that he seemed more interested in than any timetable. He had almost reached the station gates when he heard the hurried steps behind him and turned without surprise to see Miss Crutchley catching up, her hair pinned back severely and a look of fixed determination on her pale face. "I hoped I'd find you," she said breathlessly. "You didn't say goodbye." "An oversight, Miss Crutchley, for which I am duly ashamed." Whimsy tipped his hat with mock solemnity. "I feared you might be summoned to a sudden parish meeting to revise the order of service, and I detest goodbyes conducted through drawing-room doorways. They, too, often lead to reflections. But you're leaving." "Indeed. My work here is finished." The wheels of justice grind on, coarsely perhaps, but with some regularity. She stood for a moment, unspeaking. Then, "You'll testify." "If necessary. But I suspect there may be a plea. The evidence, you see, has arranged itself rather neatly. One cannot argue with handwriting, particularly when it confesses twice and signs both times." He said this lightly, but his eyes, which had the disconcerting habit of seeing rather more than one wished, rested on her face with something between kindness and detachment. "You knew it was him," she said quietly, "long before anyone else did. I suspected, as one suspects mildew in a cellar long before the smell becomes unmistakable. But it was more than that. You saw something none of us did." Whimsy smiled faintly. "I looked at the way people arrange their silences. It is an underrated talent. Mr. Mariner, if we must still call him that, was too polished, too indifferent to his own myth. He had the air of a man who had edited himself too many times. Miss Wragg, poor soul, was the opposite, burdened with memories she could not shed, half believed by those she had once taught to read aloud. They made a perfect opposition. And now she's dead. Now she is dead." They stood together in a silence broken only by the call of a distant wood pigeon and the faint hiss of the coming train, still out of sight. Miss Crutchley glanced away, then back. "There was something else," she said. "I didn't know if it mattered, but now, well, he said something once, before any of this, and I thought it strange." "Indeed." "We were walking up near the churchyard. I mentioned Miss Wragg in passing, how she was feeling poorly, and how the vicar had been to see her. And he stopped and said, 'The trouble with the past is that it never really stays buried. The ground's too shallow.' Then he laughed, but it wasn't quite a joke." Whimsy was quiet a moment. "He would have said that. It sounds rather like him. A man can be careful with names, habits, clothes, but not with his metaphors. That's where the truth gets out." The train had come into sight now, its plume of smoke drifting white against the morning blue. He turned slightly and looked toward the church spire, pale and sharp against the elms. "I imagine there'll be some consternation among the parish. A vacancy in the choir stalls, and the bishop obliged to write a delicate letter of regret. They'll talk, of course," she said. "They always do. But you, Miss Crutchley, you will stay?" "Yes." He regarded her for a moment. "Good. The village needs a few people who understand the weight of silence and the cost of speaking." She gave a tight smile, then said, "There's one thing I still don't quite follow. If he went to Miss Wragg in the afternoon and gave her the drug, how was the door locked from the inside? The police said it was bolted." "Ah, said Whimsy, lifting one brow. "There you reach the last of the conjurer's tricks. A bolt is no obstacle to a man who once studied stagecraft. You will recall the broken toothpick found in the study. A little gum arabic, a touch of ingenuity. He merely affixed a sliver to the bolt, passed a wire through the gap beneath the door, and pulled it into place once he'd stepped out. The cleaner might have found it, but as luck or planning would have it, she did not. And by the time it occurred to anyone to look, the bit of wood had been swept away with the ash and the dust." She said nothing for a moment. Then, "So simple." "Yes," he said. "The simplest tricks are the most difficult to detect. Magic is rarely in the method, only in the timing." The train had drawn up to the platform, the guard stepping down with a nod. Whimsy offered his hand. "I leave Coddlestone in your capable charge, Miss Crutchley. Should you uncover another homicidal curate, do send word. I may be found in Paris next month, attending to the question of a poisoned absinthe bottle and a rather uncooperative accordionist." "I'll be sure to write," she said dryly. He tipped his hat, then stepped aboard. The train began to move, slowly at first, then with increasing speed. She remained on the platform, watching until he passed out of sight behind a line of hawthorns, the book still tucked under his arm, a silhouette of absurd elegance against the haze of smoke. Later that day, Canon Melling stood before his congregation and read Miss Ragg's letter aloud. He did not editorialize. He did not weep. But those who were there said his hands trembled as he folded the paper, and that his voice had never sounded more sure when he said, "We are commanded not to judge, but we are also forbidden to turn our eyes away." The inquest returned its verdict: willful murder by poison committed by a person now in custody. Mariner did not contest it. He had retreated into the cold remoteness of those who know they have already lost everything worth keeping. The trial, it was said, would be short, perhaps even merciful. And in Coddlestone the roses continued to bloom, the hedges were trimmed, the choir practiced its psalms, and Mrs. Robotham told everyone 3 times that she'd always suspected him of being not quite right, but that one did not like to say so of a man who gave generously to the harvest supper. In London, Lord Peter Whimsy filed the newspaper clipping into a folder marked M, along with a copy of Miss Ragg's last note and a photograph of the ivy-framed lodge. Then he made himself a drink, sat in his favorite armchair, and opened his book of verse to a page he had marked days ago. "Gather ye rosebuds while ye may, old time is still a-flying." He smiled and murmured, "And sometimes he flies back. Would you like me to begin the epilogue?" It was nearly 3 weeks later that Lord Peter Whimsy, seated once more in his Piccadilly flat amid shelves that seemed to breed rare volumes in Latin, received a small envelope of curious thickness and some haste. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable, angular, inked with controlled precision. It was from Miss Crutchley. Inside, along with a single folded page, was a photograph. He turned it over in his fingers with idle curiosity. It was taken from the churchyard wall at Coddlestone, the view looking eastward. The church itself stood in the middle distance, serene and smug as a sleepy bishop. The lodge, just visible in the crook of a hedge, showed its ivy-covered gable, and beyond that, a length of orchard now run to misty autumn. Whimsy turned to the letter and read, "Dear Lord Peter, the trial concluded yesterday." He did not speak in his own defense. In fact, he spoke only once. When the judge asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, he replied, "She always liked violets." I don't know what it meant. Perhaps nothing at all. There was some debate over whether to suppress Miss Ragg's letter for fear of its tone being too emotive, but Canon Melling insisted it be included in full. He said, "There are some truths which cannot be paraphrased." I'm grateful for that. The villagers have already begun to revise their memories. The mariner who arrived 4 years ago has been split into 2 persons. the kindly vicar who ran the harvest fair, and the other, that fellow with a past, who now appears in all retellings as having had shifty eyes and a suspicious silence. I'm staying on. They've offered me a permanent position at the school, and I think it will do me good to remain with the children. They do not judge as quickly, and they forget a little more kindly. I wanted you to have the photograph. It seemed to me that you noticed something in that landscape that the rest of us never quite saw. Perhaps you still do. With sincere thanks, Agnes Crutchley Whimsy folded the letter with a long exhalation and tucked it into his pocket. He stood and walked to the hearth, where a modest fire burned under the marble mantel. The photograph he set on the edge of the shelf beside a silver match case and a small faded miniature of Harriet taken in Venice. He poured himself a whiskey, neat, and stared at the flames. There were still things he knew that Miss Crutchley did not understand. That Mariner had been born Stephen Allerton, an intelligent and emotionally frail man who had suffered one of those long, private humiliations at the hands of a bitter schoolmistress in a minor Derbyshire parish, Miss Ragg, before she moved south and aged into remorse. She had recognized him at once. Perhaps she had not meant to torment him. Perhaps she thought she could apologize in some spectral, penitential way. But memory is not subject to reason. For Allerton, each visit was a resuscitation of shame, carefully pressed under the weight of decades. The letters she sent him after their first meeting, trembling apologies, half-poems, odd biblical references, were not hate mail, but they read like ghost stories to a man whose identity depended on being forgotten. It was no wonder he had cracked. It was, perhaps, only astonishing that he had lasted so long in his assumed kindness. Whimsy understood something of that, the slow poison of public memory. He had seen it before. People build their names like barricades, brick by brick, and the past leaks in through the mortar. Still, it had been murder. Calculated, administered with laudanum, he would not soften it. Bunter entered with a quiet knock. "You asked to be reminded, my lord. The appointment at Gray's Inn. Shall I call for the car?" Whimsy nodded. "Yes. And Bunter, bring along that box from the study, would you? The one with the cobblestone files. I may want to revisit the case notes." "Very good, my lord." And Bunter, "Yes, my lord. Have you ever considered how dangerous apologies can be?" Bunter, with his usual grave poise, said after a moment, "They depend greatly, my lord, on whether they are offered in good faith or received in bad memory." Whimsy smiled faintly. "Quite so." He took his coat and hat and stepped into the soft grey of the late afternoon. The London air was thick with November, and already the gas lamps flickered along the square. As the car pulled away, he reached once into his pocket, touched the edge of the photograph, and withdrew his hand again. Behind him, the fire burned steadily. On the mantel, Herrick's book lay closed, with a dried violet pressed between the final pages.